got a lot of slides for you, but sometimes they can be a little bit helpful. So I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, this is the corona crisis. Is it an opportunity for change and awakening? And you probably won't be surprised that my answer, I personally feel the answer is yes, and I think a lot of you do as well, which is probably why you're here. I'm also very excited to be unveiling for the virtually the first time this new project, new work that I'm developing at the moment, co-creating our future, and I'll say a little bit more about that later as well. Okay, so we can take the title, if you like, a little bit further. You know, does the pandemic offer us an opportunity to transform our lives, our communities, and our planet for the better? And if so, how do we go about that? So what I would like to do, the first thing I'd like to do, and let me see if I've got it on the first slide, those are the books, and I just put those up because I wanted to show you how of the 4 titles, 3 of them have got the word emergency or crisis in them. So I think I'm getting a little bit typecast here. And actually it was the alcohol recovery book. It was when I was working on that book that I was really able to heal my relationship with my father. So the first thing I'd like to address today is the relationship between the personal and planetary crisis. The parallels, you know, I've been interested in the kind of global perspective ever since I wrote my first book 10 years ago. And partly because my academic background is in international relations, so I've always had half an eye on the global perspective. And I've kind of, you know, I've been exploring the parallels between the personal and the global crisis of awakening. And now with the pandemic, I think, you know, I'll be able to illustrate to you much more clearly because we've got an example kind of right in front of us. So let me just stop sharing that for a sec. Okay, so in terms of some of the parallels, and forgive me if I look down from time to time, I'm kind of looking at my notes. I've got some notes here. So what are the features of a crisis of awakening? And some of you will recognize these from your personal experience by the sounds of things, and maybe a lot of you. One thing is the intensity. You know, if sometimes these can be kind of slow, gradual, quite drawn out experiences, but often they can happen, they can really speed up and happen very fast and be very intense. So when I was in Egypt in crisis in 2003, I ended up in a wheelchair, even though there was nothing physically wrong with my legs. But what I was going through was so intense, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, that my legs gave way and I couldn't work. I couldn't walk for a few days. So very intense and very fast. You know, I was only in Egypt for a week, and yet that was the kind of the intensity it was mainly in that 1 week. And you know, just to give you a little bit of sense of well, what was it that was so intense? Because I think sometimes these inner experiences, because it's all happening inside, it's difficult to necessarily get a sense. But I mean, what I experienced in Egypt was, on the one hand, just what felt like the entire suffering of humanity going back to the beginning of time. And I know I'm not alone. You know, this is something that other people sometimes experience. And yet within that week, I also experienced I had you know, an extraordinary sense of who we really are. So kind of these extremes of a kind of huge kind of, yeah, extremes, opposites that I was holding within that 1 week. So if we look now at the global situation, this crisis that we've got with the pandemic, we can see it's been very intense. It was incredibly fast. I mean, 1 minute nobody'd heard of the coronavirus or COVID-19, and the next minute we were all kind of in lockdown. So very intense, very fast, and also these kind of extremes. You know, we've seen extremes of really moving, incredible generosity and kindness, and yet at the same time we've also seen, you know, police brutality in the suburbs, in the poorer suburbs of Paris, for example, and we've seen governments, particularly more autocratic governments, really kind of impinging upon civil liberties. And, you know, one of the things that can happen when civil liberties are withdrawn is that more autocratic governments can be very slow to give them back. And so, you know, we have a situation, for example, with the Irish terrorism, you know, when with the Northern Ireland situation, when civil liberties were taken away, even though the situation is kind of been resolved, not all of those rights have been given back. So we've got this huge, again, contrast and extremes of generosity and kindness, and also just grief and loss and tragedy. So we're holding a lot. We're all of us collectively holding a huge amount. What else can we say in terms of, yeah, one of the things that can happen with spiritual crisis is that everything that is familiar can get stripped away. So some people, you know, this can happen incredibly rapidly. I remember Jen, who shared her story in my book, in my first book, you know, kind of relationships ended, work, hurt, you know, but basically we can end up losing all the things that kind of normally characterize our daily life in terms of our work, our home, our relationships. It can all get stripped away, which is, you know, traumatic in itself and incredibly challenging to deal with. And I know that some of you will have had to deal with some of this. And this is what we can see with the virus as well. You know, everything that was familiar suddenly got stripped away. The kids can't go to school, you know, people can't go to work, we can't socialize, we can't see family. We're stripped back to the bare essentials, basically food and, you know, procuring our food and healthcare. And of course, and this is where it starts to get interesting, our priorities change. Okay, when we've been through these experiences at the personal level, we don't want to kind of recreate the life we had before because our priorities have changed, our values and our beliefs have changed. You know, if I look at the person I was when I was 20 and you know, the person I've become, it's, you know, it's almost like two completely different people. And, you know, we're seeing this with the pandemic as well. And in fact, you know, hopefully more and more we can kind of take time to reflect on what are our true priorities and in what way are our values and beliefs changing. And I'll come back to this a little bit more as well. Okay, so at this point, I'd just like to open it up to everybody to see if anybody would like to share in terms of, you know, the parallels. Are there any parallels that I haven't mentioned that you see? Is there anything you'd like to comment on or share or ask at this point? So yeah, Susan will unmute everybody. And okay, maybe we won't do it like that. Susan, sorry, if you could mute everybody again. And what we'll do, putting your hand, I think you click on participants at the bottom and you should get a chance. Yes, it'll open up a box for you, and down in the bottom right hand corner you can raise your hand, and that way we can bring you on and Susan can unmute you. So anybody want to comment on anything? Or ask anything? Or share anything? You know, there's a lot of us here. I wouldn't be at all surprised if you're feeling shy. Great. So Jules, Susan will just unmute you, Jules. Great.
Hi. What I'm really interested in is what you touched on about past lives. You know, you mentioned that you had to do some work, and I was wondering how that came about, you know, how you knew to go down that road, and kind of just a bit more about that, really. That's what I'm really interested in.
Yeah, great. Thanks for asking that, Jules. Well, what happened was I mentioned that I took myself off on retreat for 2 months, and I took myself off on retreat for 2 months because I really needed to give myself the time to make sense of what I've been going through. And actually, I'm going to come on to this in a moment, actually, looking at the 3 key stages of how we move successfully through these experiences. And actually, I mean, I can touch on that now because it's kind of relevant, really, is that, you know, the first key stage of how we move through spiritual crisis, spiritual emergency, is that we just get, and any crisis, really, this is true of any crisis, it's also very much true of the pandemic, we just get through it as best we can. So we stay safe and we get through the worst of it as best we can. And obviously, you know, there's a lot that we could say about that in terms of support, in terms of, yeah, all the kind of things that we need in order to be able to get through it. And I'm coming to your question, Jules. So that's the first key stage. And then the second key stage, and by the way, these 3 stages of moving successfully through the process, it's, you know, it's not a linear thing, really. You know, these stages can overlap. We can move in and out of them, backwards and forwards. But the second key stage is kind of making sense of it. You know, what on earth was that all about? What was it that needed healing? What is it that was coming up from the unconscious? Because usually it's kind of like a volcano exploding with material, with all this kind of lava and, you know, molten lava and rocks and ash of all the stuff that comes up that needs addressing, all the stuff that is presenting itself to be healed. A huge amount of material, usually, which is why it's so important to get some help and support with it. So I took myself off on retreat for 2 months to give myself the time and space to be able to begin to make sense of it, to integrate it, because, you know, it can take quite some time. It can take years to really fully make sense of it. And in fact, you'll see some of it, what I'll be sharing towards the end is actually, you know, it's taken me 17 years to actually make sense of it and to even be able to share it publicly. So Jules, what happened when I was on retreat for those 2 months is I was doing a lot of meditating, and some kind of images started to come through, to break through in my meditations. And, you know, at first they were just kind of like pictures, like movie pictures. There was nothing too horrendous. I think that's how stuff can present itself, because if the really challenging stuff came up straight away, I think it would, it just didn't, well, certainly for me, that wasn't how the process worked. The images started coming up slowly and gently. And then as more started coming through, I started to realize that, I just started to get a sense of what was happening. And then I got hold of a book because I wanted to start researching and investigating. I got hold of a book by Roger Wilger, and one section in particular just totally resonated. I felt it in my body as I was reading it, and I thought, yeah, this is what I need to do. And I sought him out very quickly after that and did some work with him. Amazing guy, such a loss. He passed over very young, actually. So obviously his time, he was obviously needed more on the other side. So I hope that answered your question. Yeah, but it was when I was giving myself the time and space. So looks like Margaret's got a question. Is that, Margaret, you putting your hand up because you've got a question?
Yes,
yeah.
If you could please give me his name. I didn't, Roger.
Let me write it in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'd just like to pick up then to say a little bit about these. I was talking about the 3 key stages of moving successfully through crisis, and I mentioned the second key stage where we
Catherine,
take. Yeah, Coco.
sorry, it's Coco. I had my hand up. I don't know if you saw.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see. No.
I think there's a few there.
I'm not going to be able to get to everybody, otherwise we won't get through. Well, let's see how we go. What did you want to ask, Coco?
No, just 2 things that I thought were really interesting, but my sound went out, so I didn't catch it all. But one was that your first experience was 20 years before the last one, which was exactly the same timeline as my own, a 20-year block between. And also, when you were saying the second time round was so intense last year, but it did feel like I was feeling the pain of the whole world, which is very hard to put into context. So thank you for saying that, because it's the first time that someone's verbally said that out loud. And it's resonated that, yes, it was so intense because of that. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Coco. Thank you very much indeed. And by the way, I do really value your contribution. I will try to get to as many of you as I can, because I think this is what makes our session today, very rich. And yeah, and I think, Coco, just to say to that, I think it is, it's obviously something that I don't know how many people experience, but it's obviously part of the process. I mean, there are still aspects of this process that are totally mysterious to me. Great. Okay. Is there anybody else who has kind of like a burning question before we move on then? You'll need to, those of you that have not got your camera on, you would need to raise your hand by using the box by clicking on participants at the bottom. Okay, I'm not seeing any. Great. So in terms of this second key stage of moving through, I mentioned that I took myself off on retreat, and of course, it may not have escaped your notice that we've all been on retreat. We've been in lockdown, and so nature through this virus has given us this opportunity to be at home. Right. Okay. So Natalie says there are 4 people who've had their hands up. Okay. So let me just carry on a little bit. Otherwise, I'm going to completely lose my thread. I'll come back to you, and we'll see if we can work out a better system of me seeing who's. Okay. So now I'm seeing. Okay. Now I can see the hands. Okay. Okay. Great. Okay, thank you. Yeah, and thank you, Susan, for your message. Great. Good. So, sorry, I'm trying to do too many things at once here. So yeah, so here we are on retreat, kind of effectively at home. And I know that, for some people it's been an incredibly busy time, and other people have actually had a quieter time. But you're probably also familiar with or some of you may be familiar with the analogy of this lovely metaphor that we use, the process of kind of spiritual crisis and transformation and awakening, which is the caterpillar, the caterpillar, and then, the chrysalis and the butterfly that emerges. And of course, here we are at the moment in the cocoon of our homes, in the chrysalis of our homes. And I don't know if you know this, but apparently what happens with the caterpillar is that it completely dissolves. It turns to liquid and actually holds within it the kind of the imaginal cells, the DNA, to become the butterfly. And this is kind of essentially, you know, it's a perfect metaphor for what happens when we go through this process at the personal level. And so I kind of like to think, you know, that you know, that there's this potential, you know, we are holding now in our cocoons, in our lockdown, we're holding these, the DNA, the imaginal cells for the evolution of humanity, of mankind. So yeah. So, and then the third key stage is where once we've, and here I think the second and third stages kind of can overlap quite a lot, is going back out into the world. So we kind of take the gifts, if we think in terms of hero's journey terms, and often the hero's journey can be very helpful for the stage of kind of making sense of it and integrating it. And then in hero's journey terms, you know, what is the reward? You know, what is it that we take back into our lives, back out into the world? What is the elixir? What have we gained? These gifts that we're harnessing. And this is where people's lives change direction, sometimes quite considerably. Certainly mine certainly did. You know, as we take the learning and the shift back out into the world. And so this is, you know, at the moment in terms of the pandemic, we're already moving into the third phase. We're already, you know, the lockdown in some places being eased, the restrictive measures are being eased, and we're starting to move kind of back out into the world. But of course, we can't go back to business as normal, business as usual. At the personal level, we can't, because, you know, things have changed too much. We've changed too much. Things have been stripped away. We can't, even if we wanted to, we couldn't. And to be honest, if we did, you know, it would kind of really, if we tried to go back to how things were before, it would be incredibly frustrating. And it would kind of really, it would represent the fact that we haven't taken anything from the experience, that we haven't learned anything from the experience. And this is where we're at globally now, okay? If we try to go back to business as usual, business as normal, we will not have taken anything from this experience. We won't have gained or learned anything. And to be honest, I don't think we can go back. I think our eyes have been opened. We've seen too much and learnt too much to go back to how things were before. And in particular, I think, you know, one of the things that we've seen is that the impossible, what we thought was impossible, what we were told was impossible, has suddenly become possible. So in terms of, you know, we would never have imagined that suddenly cities could have no cars in them, that we would all, you know, stop flying here, there and everywhere, that people wouldn't go to work, kids wouldn't go to school. You know, suddenly we're doing things that we didn't think we could do. And when we put our mind collectively to one thing, which in this case has been to try to reduce the number of cases, reduce the number of deaths and flatten the curve, we've seen beautifully how we can all kind of cooperate and collaborate and kind of really put our minds to one thing. So these are, you know, some of the things, and talks about, and let me put his name in the chat for you as well. If you haven't come across his work, I highly recommend it. Otto Sharma and the Presencing Institute have done this amazing work over a number of years. It's you might have heard of U theory and U lab, if you haven't heard of the Presencing Institute. And so it's very much about systemic change. And it's, you know, the work, what at the moment, their kind of analysis of what's been happening is that we've got a very good example with the pandemic of how we've started to move from ego awareness, from an ego system to an ecosystem. So the ego awareness, the ecosystem, is where our world revolves around us and our lives and our own personal individual well-being. And the eco-awareness revolves around the well-being of the whole, of all. And so what we've seen is we've really experienced interconnectedness. And I'm, forgive me if I'm saying things that are really obvious and that you've been reading about already. But we have now experienced how totally and utterly interconnected we are. The kind of what the Buddhists call the independent co-arising. And certainly what the quantum field tells us, that we are totally and utterly interconnected. And for a lot of people who are really not operating on this wavelength, they've suddenly seen how their behavior as an individual can impact on the whole, can impact on their community, impact on the wider whole. So it's been a fabulous opportunity from that point of view. And of course, if we take this to the next level, there is a sense in which we operate in a world in which the dominant paradigm has been this sense of separation, that we are separate from one another. And now, we've had a chance to drop into this sense of knowing that we're not separate. And it's interesting when I talk about these things, I feel my energy shifting and changing, just because the beauty of it, the truth of it is the truth of it is so beautiful. So this could probably be a good time for me to open up. Let me just check. I'm just looking at my notes to see. Okay, yeah. So let's open things up and see who else. So I'm seeing a couple of hands up. Rhoda, did you have a question or comment, something you'd like to share?
I had a comment actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to know, for example, during my corona period, I had a real crisis where I was stuck in a home with my mother who misunderstands the illness, and we were fighting half the time. So in the house, you're stuck with somebody who doesn't listen to you when you're trying to say something. And when you try and ask a question, she shuts down. So whenever we reach a period when the carers will listen to us, because she actually called police when I got angry, and I was detained for 1 month in hospital, where at this point, when we see the social workers, it didn't have to have happened if she had just listened to me. So when we will reach a period when people will just listen, our carers will listen to us when we have something to say. I just wanted to know.
Yeah, thank you, Rhoda, for sharing that. Sounds really, really difficult, really challenging and painful. And yeah, thank you. I think for some people, this lockdown has been excruciatingly difficult. So thank you very much, Rhoda. And I'm seeing other hands. I'm seeing Basharat. Did you have something you wanted to share or to ask or comment?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
I can. We can, yeah.
Yeah, I forgot why I put my hand up now. Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't manage to get to you earlier. Sorry.
It's all right. Yeah, I don't know. I think I found your book quite useful when I was going. I went through it and then just started a mad scramble to try and understand what the hell was going on. I found so I got your book and I got Kia Nightingale's book as well.
Kaya Nightingale, yeah.
Kaya Nightingale, Journey to Transformation. I found that useful, but not at the time. It's funny actually how I've come to this Zoom meeting, because I picked your book up again about 4 days ago, and then this meeting just popped up again because I've connected to, I think, Joe Bar family. I've never met him, but I've connected to him on Facebook. And because about 4 days ago, I started reading your book again. And when you're not drowning, you can actually, it actually goes in, I think, and you can see it. And I did get a lot of value out, your use of.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Basha. I think what you're giving there is a really good example of what I was saying earlier about how it can take us quite some time to make sense of it and integrate it. And that's great. That you can come back. You can come back to my book, to Kaya's book, and there's so much material available out there now. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way that you related the journey to Joseph Campbell's
The
hero's journey. I found that useful. But I mean, the main thing. The thing happened to me initially in Christmas 2011. I called it a Big Bang experience because it felt like a nuclear bomb, and then it happened again in Christmas 2012. Always Christmas. I don't know why. And then I had a few smaller bangs after that, and realised space underneath the ego, and it felt to me a very destructive process, a very demolishing process, like you're being taken apart, involuntarily, just taken apart. And I often thought, this spiritual awakening business, isn't this supposed to be a good thing? Because this didn't feel like a very good thing, and no spiritual teachers I'd read up to that point had told me or indicated to me that something like this could happen. I've meditated for years, I've done spiritual practice for years, and there's a lot of information about how to do spiritual practice, but no information about what happens if these things work.
Yeah, and I think what the thing is that there are a lot of spiritual teachers who maybe are not that familiar. If they haven't been through spiritual crisis themselves, or if they haven't seen students of theirs going through it, they're maybe not that familiar. And I think you're right, Bashrat. It can be a very destructive process in the sense that it's dismantling the old self. The parts of us that need healing and kind of upgrading, if you like. But it's great, that you can come back to it, that you can kind of gradually over the years make sense of it. And I think, this is the thing about the pandemic as well. It's not, at the time now, it doesn't look like a very positive experience. And for a lot of people, it hasn't been at all by any means. It's only in hindsight, or if we can step back and see the bigger picture, that we can see, that. If you don't mind, I'd love to hear from Alan as well, because Alan's had his hand up. So thank you very much, Bashrat, for sharing. Alan, what did you want to share?
I'm being muted now.
Yeah,
I wanted to comment about the hero's journey. I share your thoughts that there are real opportunities with this. There are opportunities in crisis, but I'm not sure that necessarily it's going to be taken up by governments and so forth. And I was thinking of the hero's journey because at the beginning of the hero's journey, sometimes the hero refuses the quest, and that's almost part of the process. No, to like the first time to actually not take up the quest. And I'm just wondering if this might be the case. I think for some individuals, and there will be change, and there will be some change. But I think systemically, there's the problem that, say, for instance, just yesterday, apparently Boris Johnson was talking about going ahead with infrastructure projects because they want to stimulate economic growth. And as we all know, this addiction to growth is the real crisis, is the climate crisis and the extinction of species. So I just want to make the point that there is real potential, but maybe the quest won't be taken up this time. Maybe there might be we'll need a bigger crisis in a sense. Anyway, I just wanted to offer that.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Thank you for that. And you know, I think you're right. I don't see governments seizing this opportunity. You know, I think it's up to us. And this is, you know, this is what's amazing about the work that Otto Scharmer and the Presencing Institute have done. Because, you know, over the last few years, they've kind of once a year they've kind of taken a group of people. They've taken like 1,000 people, maybe 2,000 people on this kind of collective journey, kind of exploring the whole kind of systemic change thing. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, they realized that this was what they call a moment of disruption. Okay, and when there's a moment of disruption, there is an opportunity for change. And so they decided to create an added, you know, an extra journey at a time of year. They normally do them kind of in the autumn, I think. So they opened it up because they do it. It's all free and it's all on these kind of mass open learning kind of platforms through the Presencing Institute. They opened it up initially to, I think, 5,000, and the places were filled within hours. So then they opened it up to 10,000. I think they then kind of opened it up to 15,000 people. So there are now 15,000 people around the world kind of, you know, all working, and a lot of these people are kind of people who are kind of actively involved in their communities with various different projects and organizations and bodies and businesses who are, you know, really coming together. And I think, you know, it's a moment for us to seize the opportunity. It's no good. I mean, in a sense, this is what Greta Thunberg has said, hasn't she? You know, it's kind of, it's no good, you know, waiting for governments. We need to seize the moment. And I want to kind of come on to that and say a little bit more about that. So I see one other hand up, and then I'd just like to move on. So John, did you want to share something? It'd be lovely to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Catherine. I was kind of aware when you were talking about your own process, the two experiences you had, one of which was medicalized, one of which you were able to work through much more straightforwardly, that this is really, you know, what we're witnessing at the moment in this idea, this sort of fantasy that we can return to some kind of normality, is rather similar to what actually takes place when somebody has a breakdown of this sort, and you know, the medical services are rung and the psychiatric services are called for. The attempt to re-establish some kind of toxic normality that one was unconsciously trying to escape from in order to grow. And this is kind of the choice that we face. A lot of effort will be undoubtedly put in by you know, the conventional forces to try and reestablish what they consider to be normal, and thereby what they consider to be right, which most of us perceive as it no longer meets the needs of the world.
Absolutely.
So it is very much like that we have to proceed on a healing journey rather than anything that attempts to establish the status quo ante.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that, John. And you know, that gives me, you know, something that I wanted to talk about actually is, you know, I think we have a situation that can feel a little bit like a David and Goliath, because, you know, here we are, we have Goliath, we're up against this vast power of multinational companies, of fossil fuel companies, and yet we have David, and you know, and I see kind of us, the people, as David, and this is you know, what I'm excited about in terms of the work of kind of where I'm heading and this new project, co-creating our future, is that it's you know, it's really about tapping into the quantum field. And when you tap into the quantum field, the possibilities are limitless. It's absolutely unlimited. And I think this is our secret weapon. This is David's sling. That, you know, when we know how to harness the quantum field and work with the quantum field, then we can achieve a huge amount. And I think, you know, the work that the Presencing Institute and Otto Scharmer are doing is very encouraging, because a lot of it is based on awareness. You know, one of the things about, you know, you know, I am not a scientist, but you know, the basics that I have grasped of quantum physics is this idea that, you know, the observer impacts on what he or she is observing. And so, you know, we have this relationship between observer and observed. And I've lost my thread. I've forgotten why I was saying that. Okay, it might come back to me. Apologies. Okay, so I did want to say a little bit. I'm way out of time. We've got about half an hour left. I did want to say a little bit about because I did promise to share a little bit about the kind of visionary material that came through to me when I was in crisis in 2003. And I mentioned earlier, it's taken me 17 years to kind of be able to kind of process this and make sense of it. Not because I didn't kind of have a sense of what it meant on one level, but in terms of what it meant for my life and my work, that's what's taken me quite a long time to work out. So now, you know, in terms of dreams, the way that a dream works is that often the symbolism can operate at different levels. So there's this kind of metaphor, you know, when we unpack a dream, there can be kind of different layers to it. And this is also true, I think, you know, of visionary material. And certainly, if any of you are familiar with the work of Dolores Cannon, and when she was kind of unpacking Nostradamus's prophecies that were written, they're written in quatrains, which is kind of like these 4-lined kind of mini poems. I think they might even be rhyming, all in French. But one of the reasons that they've been so difficult to decipher and unpack is because each one has multiple layers of meaning. And so, you know, this, I think, you know, in terms of the kind of the vision that I had when I was in crisis, there are different layers of meaning to it. And I also want to say, you know, that this kind of material is not something that happens to me regularly. You know, it was literally only that one time. I do sometimes get, you know, guidance, and I do kind of get downloads, but this kind of vision that I had when I was in crisis was of a different nature, and it was because I was completely kind of blasted open. I was just on a different plane, and I know that some of you will know what I'm talking about. So what I saw, and this, you know, as I say, this was 17 years ago now, what I saw was a vast number of souls leaving the planet all at the same time, simultaneously. And so I had a sense that that there was some, you know, on the one hand, it was an ecstatic vision, because I have to tell you that when that many souls leave the planet, there's incredible light and glory and yeah, I mean, it's difficult to find the words for it. And yet at the same time, I knew that, you know, that this meant that there were a lot of deaths. And in fact, I wrote an article about a year ago where I was exploring these parallels between personal process of crisis of awakening through crisis and the planetary process. And I actually didn't submit it for publication because I was talking about this kind of, you know, high death toll that we were likely to see, the kind of level of crisis that was going to give us the kind of opportunity for awakening that we've now got. And I knew that it was going to involve a lot of kind of deaths, of a loss of life. And I wasn't sure how it would be received, and so I decided not to submit it for publication. And yet now, you know, I can talk about this because it's happening and it's here. And it was obviously what I was seeing was very much, you know, this period that we're going through. And at the same time, I was another layer, if you like, in terms of the bit that's taken me so long to unpack and work out what it means for me and my work, is the aspect of the evolution of consciousness. That you know, another layer of the metaphor, of the symbolism of this vision was the ascension of humanity. And I hesitate to use the word ascension because I think it can be misconstrued, it can be used and misused, and it has certain connotations. I prefer to talk about a shift in consciousness, or a kind of an awakening of consciousness. But certainly, you know, I realized that there were these two aspects to the vision. But at the same time as all these people were dying and souls leaving the planet, there was also this kind of this shift, this awakening that was happening. And of course, this is, you know, this is what happens at the personal level. You know, there is a death. This is, you know, the whole death and rebirth is very powerful in the personal process, because there's a death of the old self. There's an ego death, even if it's only temporary. And so again, you know, these are themes that parallels that we can see between the personal and the planetary. So, you know, the last year, or you know, certainly last year was very much a kind of gestational period for me, very much a kind of period of incubation, where I was kind of sitting with this vision and exploring what it meant. And so the new work around co-creating our future has come out of that, in terms of, you know, I think it's so easy to focus on what isn't working and what we don't want. And what feels much more powerful for me is to focus on the future that we do want to create, the world that we do want to create. It's far more powerful. You know, if we start attacking that which isn't working, it can end up just kind of creating an entrenched position. You know, if we think in terms of non-violent communication, you know, it's about looking for win-win solutions. It's not about creating conflict, really. So you know, the co-creating our future, and I can let me share my screen again for a moment. In fact, I completely forgot about my slides, so I haven't actually shared any of my slides. That was in Egypt when I was in crisis. Okay, this is a couple of slides that I did want to share, and you've probably seen this, but this is Los Angeles before the pandemic, the smog, and then after. And in fact, it's a bit blurred because I've enlarged it a bit too much. But you know, this is nature regenerating herself. And the dolphins that have been spotted off the south coast of England. A friend of my cousin saw them just a few days ago, and also they've been seen in the canals of Venice. And hopefully some of you saw a really beautiful video that went viral, which was all the kind of big cities of the world that were deserted with no traffic, no kind of humans, but wildlife that you wouldn't normally see in a city. So there were pictures of elephants, probably somewhere in, I don't know where it was actually, probably somewhere in India. There were penguins in South Africa. You know, it was just an absolutely fabulous thing, and quite sad to think that, you know, already the traffic is starting to build back up again. And so, yeah, so in terms of co-creating our future, there are different aspects of the project. There's a podcast which Susan, who's helping us out today on the tech side, she and I have been developing this together, which is very exciting. We're going to very much be showcasing the future that is already here. You know, there are people leading from the emerging future. There are people already doing a fantastic work that we want to see more of. So we're very much going to be showcasing that. And then I'm also starting to deliver programs around helping people harness the gifts from their crisis, their personal crisis, or from the corona crisis, to kind of really kind of get in touch with what is your piece, you know, what is your piece of the jigsaw that you're holding? What is your unique contribution? And, you know, what is yours to do? So kind of helping people really kind of get in touch with that, and then do the inner work to, you know, in terms of tapping into the quantum field to be able to kind of create that in the world in a really powerful and impactful way. So that's what I'm starting to do. And in fact, I've got the first one starting, which I'm offering through Hawkwood, and I'll put that in the chat in a moment. It's just a short 3-week course as a kind of little taster, and it's kind of me starting to pilot the work a little bit. And yeah, so that's happening. And I'm also very open to having conversations with people about, I guess there's an element for me of research at the moment. I'm still kind of figuring this out. I'm, you know, still developing this, and it is about co-creating. So it's about collaborating. And so I'm kind of doing some interviews, stakeholder interviews, but I think interview makes it sound like quite a formal thing. It's really just kind of having a chat and finding out what people need and want and what's going to work for them to support them on their journey to helping us kind of create the future that we want collaboratively. So I had a webinar a few days ago, and one of the issues that came out was the sense of overwhelm of just how huge the task is that we have ahead of us, and you know, the self-care comes in here, and I think, you know, a lot of us, probably all of us on this call, have had to work quite hard at figuring out how to look after ourselves. This kind of radical self-care, especially during the pandemic, we've had to really ramp up our self-care. And so I'm inviting you, the reason I've put the link there, the calendly.com, is that's my calendar for booking to have a chat with me. So if you are up for kind of having a chat and helping me with the research, the background research, then that would be fantastic. Likewise, if there's any way that I can support you right now, you know, I've been offering free sessions during the pandemic. So if you need any, just any kind of support at the personal level, then I'm very happy to, you know, for us to have a session, have some time together, 45 minutes. And so yeah, feel free to book that up. There's some, you know, there should be plenty of slots next week. In fact, what I'll do is I'll maybe put in a few extra slots given the number of us on this call today. So I just want to stop sharing that. I also want to stop talking. I think I've spoken far too much. I've spoken plenty, and let's take some questions and comments. So we've got. I thought I saw Shula. Maybe Shula, you put your hand back down again. So Nicola.
Yeah, hi Catherine. Thank you very much for what you've been sharing with us. I have two questions. The one, I would like to understand better how you would differentiate between a crisis per se and a spiritual crisis. That's my first question. And the second question is, because obviously you've been so immersed for years and you have your own network, but what I'm wondering is, what are your thoughts, what each of us can do to make a global change?
Great. Thank you for those questions, Nicola. I mean, you know, I think we each have, and this is kind of what I was alluding to, I think we each have our own unique contribution, our own piece to play. And, you know, one of the things that I'm doing, certainly through the Hawkwood, the online course there, is helping people to work out what their piece is. And, you know, somebody like Andrew Harvey, you know, his take on it, he's done a lot of work around activism, kind of conscious activism. He actually calls it sacred activism, but it's, you know, it's conscious activism. Is, you know, he says, well, you know, what is it that breaks your heart? You know, what is the one issue that absolutely breaks your heart? Maybe you've got, there's some work for you to do around that. I personally, I wouldn't necessarily go that way. I tend to kind of more follow my bliss and follow my heart, in the sense of what brings me joy and gratitude and love. But that's one take on it. And the other thing is that we can spend some time focusing on what our values, if we don't feel or hear a clear calling to what our piece is, what our unique contribution is, then we can maybe start by exploring what is most important to us, what our priorities and values are. But certainly, in terms of, it's not as if with callings, it's not as if we just have one calling in life. It's like one big, huge calling and that's it. I think we can put ourselves under a huge amount of pressure that way. It's more, probably that we have different callings at different times of our life, and we kind of follow our heart in different ways at different times. So sometimes it might be a smaller calling, sometimes maybe a bigger one. Often if it feels scary, then we kind of know we're onto something, because it's going to stretch us beyond our comfort zones. So these are some of the things that we'll be exploring together on the online program. So yeah, and your other question in terms of the distinction between crisis and spiritual crisis, I don't really make a huge distinction. My first book was very much geared towards the kind of transpersonal and the kind of mind, body, spirit kind of field, if you like. But then I was approached after that by a more mainstream publisher who basically wanted me to cover the same kind of material, looking at kind of mental health, the interface between mental health and spirituality, but in a more mainstream way, using more mainstream language. But my message was basically the same, that all of these experiences are an opportunity for healing and for growth. And so even though I kind of, the title is more mainstream, the language is more mainstream, all my books have the same message, really. So I hope that kind of answers your questions. I'm also seeing Bashrat, who's got your hand up.
Yeah, there's just a couple of things I wanted to run by you very quickly. I'll be as quick as I can. The overriding question for me, can you hear me okay? Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. The overriding question for me when all this started happening about 9 years ago was how do you live from the space, true self, whatever you want to call it. I just called it the space because it had a very space-like quality to it. So how do you live from the space? The second thing that occurred to me was this is some sort of because it's part of the destructive process, this is a purification process. And thirdly, my sense is that this is going to take years for the mind and the body to align with what I've seen with the space. So that these things occurred to me pretty early on. Firstly, how do you live from the space? This all seems to be some sort of purification process to hold more light or whatever. I'm not really sure. And then thirdly, it's going to take a while for the space itself is complete, but it's going to take a while for the mind and body to come into alignment with it as part of that purification process.
Thank you, Bashra. Yes, it and that's what we were saying earlier, wasn't it? That, it can take quite a while and it can take a number of years. And I think at the global level, if we see this as some kind of, in terms of the parallels that we were looking at, it's going to take time. And somebody earlier, it might have been Alan, mentioned, that maybe we're going to need further crises and even bigger crises to actually kind of really start dismantling the systems that are not working. We have this incredible, this drive, this push towards more and more economic growth, and it's just not serving us. But what is it going to take for these systems to really collapse?
Yeah, but I was thinking more of this question of how do you live from the space, because as everything collapses, even decisions don't happen the same way, because the person who you thought you were, all of that stuff you wanted falls apart. So the way decisions is being made, it's weird for me to not want anything or not need anything. And I've studied enough psychology to know that any psychologist would be alarmed at that statement. You know, you don't want anything, you don't need anything. But this space doesn't want anything or need anything, and is inherently fulfilling in and of itself.
Yeah. And isn't that beautiful, Bashra? And you know, this is the awakening that we need at the global level. You know, when we can get to the place where people don't need more than just their basic needs. They don't want more and more stuff. They don't want more and more material stuff. They don't need or want anything. They're just happy to kind of be. And you know, this, and I think we're going to see I hope that we're going to see a big move back towards living very simply, you know, and kind of really, just simplifying our lives. And in fact, I know I've had quite an urge for quite a while now to just kind of live in a hut somewhere with just one bowl and one spoon. And I mean, we'll see whether I can actually put that in place. But good, thank you very much for that. So would anybody else, I'd love to hear, as we wrap up, I'd love to hear maybe just some kind of one or two maybe insights that you're taking away from today, one or two, I don't know, just aha moments, something that you're taking away from our time together. Does anybody want to share? Just to kind of by way of wrapping up, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm quite keen for us to finish on time.
Catherine, I'll speak. It's Coco.
Oh, Coco, hi.
Hi. Just seeing in the chat and then listening to you as well, that there seems to be, even though it seems chaotic, there's a definite pattern to the individual and the collective awakening, even to the point of timescales in people's life when they have the first and the second and that integration phase. And I truly believe that the stages, it's almost like what Bashar was saying, there's a stage where body and mind have to unify, and then there's a stage where what I'm calling my soul essence comes in, and it's a definite kind of it almost feels like it's ordained to be that way, really. So I'm taking that away because it just makes me feel that it's easier to sit in the unknown then, because you kind of know there's a pattern to this. It's not just one chaotic big thing. And just on a personal note, Catherine, so grateful for you saying this, because my vision 20 years ago was very similar to you. Saw so many souls dying, the world crumbling. I was like, oh my God, you know, the world's coming to an end. But as you say, over time you get shown little snippets and you begin to understand your place in it. But yeah, at the time my family thought I was going bananas, and so did I, because I couldn't explain why I saw so many people dying. But yeah, thank you, it's been fascinating.
Good, you're very welcome, Coco. Thank you so much for sharing that, because you know, I do really appreciate when people share quite personal stuff in such a, you know, we've got a big group here, it's quite a public group, we've got a lot of people that we can't actually see, so you know, and maybe we can just all kind of celebrate each other, and especially those who have shared today, you know, how much that brings to the group. I really appreciate it. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? I suspect that a lot of people have had some kind of precognitive sense of you know, what was to come. Some people more clearly, more obviously than others. It reminds me of Carl Jung, actually. You know, Carl Jung had horrendous visions, and I think it must have been about 1913. Mick will correct me if I've got the dates completely wrong. But he was seeing these visions, these kind of blood baths. You know, he was just seeing rivers of blood. And actually, he thought he was heading for a major kind of breakthrough, breakdown. You know, I think the language he used was actually psychotic, probably. I think he used that language. And yet, you know, when a few months later or a year later, that when the First World War broke out, he realized that what he had been seeing was actually, you know, it was precognitive in that sense. And so, and you know, I think sometimes it's difficult for us to separate out what is the personal unconscious and what is the collective. You know, and if even Jung can get muddled and confused between the personal and the collective, then, you know, then no wonder the rest of us do. But yeah, okay. Anybody else got any last comment or anything you want to share? Anything you're taking away from today?
Can I
Sure.
say something here?
Hi. Good to see you
Hi.
here.
Yeah, nice to be here. And very nice presentation. Agreed with everything you said, and I appreciated the level of detail that you give regarding personal crisis versus what's going on, and especially the shock of the whole thing, just really coming out of nowhere. New Year's Eve, we were just having a ball, you know. We thought 2020 was going to be great. That was it, you know. And now it's like we're in the middle of this thing. And I guess just to bring up the flip side, though, regarding the awakening, yeah, I'm a little bit shocked, not only how many people don't see the spiritual awakening aspect of this whole thing, but the number of people who don't even recognize that we're in a global crisis with a disease. The level of denial, I think, has been really, really shocking, especially in the United States. It's pretty strong here in Brazil, too. North Europe has been a little bit more responsible, but I know England's had its troubles. But yeah, it's like
England. I don't think the British government has been responsible at all.
No, and maybe just one last thing. I disagree a little bit where, you know, when we blame governments, big chunks of our populations elect governments, right? And so those governments do reflect a part of us, right? And so if we're looking at the governments and we're blaming the governments, well, we elected these people in some way. At least a big chunk of us did. So I don't know if it's going to be an us or them. And I also think that my gut says to go back to normal right now is not enough. I think we're really going to have to feel this. Like every awakening I've had associated with a good kick in the balls, you know? And I just don't think we're there yet. I don't see us on our knees yet. And I think maybe that's what it's going to take. And maybe that's why it takes a few of these pandemics, you know, something to really humble and, you know.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much for that. And that's kind of your kind of echoing in a sense what Alan was saying. I think it was Alan earlier who was saying, you know, that
yeah.
And in terms of governments, it's interesting, isn't it, that, you know, basically we do not have democratic systems. We need citizens' assemblies. You know, we need to completely rethink how we're doing our political systems. But I mean, that's another whole conversation, another whole topic for another time. But thank you very much. And actually, I just want to, on a funny note, I put out a video. You mentioned New Year's Eve. I put out a video on my YouTube channel on the 30th of December. And I called it Fasten Your Seatbelts for 2020. And I looked back at it the other day, and actually, I mean, you know, at the time, none of us knew about the pandemic. But I was really recommending that we kind of don't kind of get caught up in the drama, that we kind of step back and that, you know, and that we consume our media with a lot of awareness and kind of consciousness, kind of mindfulness. And when I looked back at it, I thought, oh my goodness, you know, on some level we knew, and I think, Sean, you were saying, you know, we were having a ball, we were having, you know, New Year's Eve parties and things, but I think on some level we maybe knew this was coming. Certainly that's what the video that I put out suggests. Yeah.
I wish I could say the same. I didn't know this was coming at all.
Well, I didn't know consciously,
Blindsided.
you know, I didn't know on a conscious level, but, you know, there are other levels as well. Great. Folks, we're nearly up for time. Thank you so, so much, everybody. It's been absolutely amazing. I particularly want to thank Joe for inviting me and for organizing this and putting it together. I would have loved to have heard from more of you. Maybe we need to do another one another time so that we can have, have another more in-depth kind of dialogue, if you like. It's always tricky getting the balance between kind of presenting and kind of dialoguing. So thank you very much. I think we can, unless anybody's got a kind of last comment, we can wrap up. Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Joe. And thank you, Susan, for help in the background with the tech.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe you could unmute all of us, Susan, just so that we can say goodbye.
Bye.
See you. Bye.
Thank you very, very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine and Joe. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, Coco.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye, Sean. Bye, Ron. Thanks, Kat.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you, Joe.
Right.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.